Hey folks, welcome back to Smart Simple Fit. I'm Davin, and today I've got a great presentation for you on exercise training variables, the simple truth about them,
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
how to navigate them, how to think about programming for them, and I want you to have a true understanding, a healthy perspective that will allow you to understand how the big picture exercise variables actually interact with each other, since I would say there's a lot of half-truths that are promoted on social media about exercise training variables, and that it's even seeped into the world of scientific literature, where you'll see studies talk about what an optimal amount of training volume looks like, or even training frequency. And so you can even end up with cases where literal exercise scientists, who are supposed to be the cutting edge experts, right? The intellectuals, the formally educated people who are going to stop us troglodytes who don't know anything from hurting ourselves and getting no gains. Well, they make the mistake, the critical error of trying to isolate training variables, when in fact we know that by definition, variables represent values that can change under different circumstances. And by the end of today's presentation, you're going to have a much better understanding of just how free you are as far as making choices in your exercise programming, so that way you can lean into your own preferences and get gains and not have to worry about stupid criticism from other people who don't know the full context of your training program, especially if you're already getting results. Okay, let's dive right into it. So there are at least a few different variables I want to address today. There's more variables than the 6 that I've laid out today, but I believe that these are probably the 6 most commonly talked about training variables. And that, of course, would be, well, probably the biggest 3, the volume, the frequency, the intensity, but then there's also some other important variables such as exercise selection, range of motion, and technique, right? The quality of technique is something that can vary from one person to another, from one exercise to another, right? This is sometimes called form policing, the idea of like making your form as optimal as possible for muscle activation or fiber direction and things like that. So I'm going to help you guys understand why these individual variables don't mean as much as you think they do. It's more like each variable is the result of what the other variable prescriptions look like. So you can only invest so many points into each one. The first variable that we need to talk about is the volume problem. How much volume of a given exercise, or maybe across the board for your exercise is plural in your program, how much volume do you need to do to make gains? How much can you handle? What is the minimum dosage, right, measured in volume? And you'll see probably a variety of different numbers. I think that if you watched 5 different videos on YouTube Fitness, you could probably end up with 5 at least significantly different answers. Some people might say 10 to 15 sets per exercise or per muscle group per week is the ideal way to train. And you might find other sources in videos that would say 20 to 30 is ideal, 10 to 20 is ideal, 8 to 12 is ideal. It just depends. And you know what's hilarious about that? Those very same people might all be quoting studies, but they're just quoting different studies. And so the numbers don't match up. So if someone tries to tell you, hey, without science, we wouldn't know the gold standard of volume prescriptions, which is like, let's say 10 to 20 sets per week, hang on, even that is contested by many people. Certainly my experience as a coach and just training myself, I have rarely hit an exercise, or let alone a muscle group itself, even my quads, which historically I've trained probably harder than any muscle group on my body. I've never done 10 to 20 sets per week. Maybe my quads somewhere like 10, 12. That'd be about it, but I've certainly never done 20 sets. And making programs for other people, I think they would fire me after like a week or two if I tried to give them 20 sets of anything, okay? You're just gonna beat up your clients needlessly if you try and make them all do 20 sets of everything. in a week. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. So this is largely the result of trying to isolate training variables themselves, and that's how you can end up with silly conclusions like, oh, you need to do 30 to 40, you need to do 20 to 30, you need to do 10 to 20, when in reality, the amount of volume that you can handle and need to do to get jacked is completely dependent on the other variables. What does volume mean? Well, typically we're not talking about total reps done, although that certainly is a perspective through which you can say, this is my volume. I did 100 reps this week, or I did 50 reps in this workout, what have you. You can even have like a rep goal system like Steve Shaw talks about, Basement Bodybuilding talks about. But typically we're talking about numbers of sets. And for that variable to make sense, you need to understand that you can handle and you need to do more sets the easier those sets are. So if you take a set to RPE 5, it's not that stimulating. It also doesn't require that much for your body to recover from it. It's just RPE 5, right? You've got 5 reps in reserve, or 5 RIR if you prefer to call it that, right? That's not that hard of a set. That doesn't mean you've committed some serious, gravest crime against humanity and you deserve to be thrown in a gulag for being a DL just because you did some of your leg press sets at RPE 5 when you could have pushed it to RPE 9 and been perfectly safe. No, it's not about calling you a sissy, but nonetheless, when you train like a sissy, you can handle more volume and you need to do more volume. If you say to yourself, well, I'm doing 5 sets of this exercise per week, or I'm doing 10, how come I'm not getting great results? It feels like I'm not any stronger. Are you actually pushing yourself? That's a very good question, because if you're just doing little, pink dumbbells, that's not enough to push progress. And so is it really a wise solution just say to that person, hey, just throw some more volume at it? That probably will work with enough volume, but is going from 10 to 15 sissy sets really the answer? Or maybe cutting it down to like 6 to 8 really good sets, still maintaining good technique, but just pushing yourself harder. And often it wouldn't be as simple as doing more reps, right? I would say in that case, when someone's training like a sissy, lift more weight. Okay, so if you're doing like 15-pound biceps curls, try 20 or 25. If you're doing like 2 plates for reps on the leg press, try doing 3.5. You probably can do it. Yours. For a lot of these people who are like just not working hard enough to get results, they're stronger than they think. And so a lot of this will come back to intensity at the end of the day. But nonetheless, you need to distinguish between what your you need to actually assess what the other variables in your program look like. Just throwing more volume at it might be a solution in the short term, but if that's how you get gains on everything, you're gonna spend a lot more time in the gym than you need to doing a bunch of sissy sets rather than just a handful of quality and intense sets. So I would say Mike Menser was right, partly. He was sort of right. He was sort of right in this idea that you can train long or hard, but not both. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement, but I will agree with the sentiment of it, where you can have training duration on one side of a spectrum and training intensity on the other, and you can't max out both. And the closer you are to maxing out one, logically, the further you are from the other. So it's actually a whole spectrum of different options that you can have. I like to train closer to that maximal intensity, but I still like to train, with more reps and sets than say someone like Mike Menser. But that doesn't mean that, he's absolutely wrong for pointing out that you can't just max out all these training stats and be like, yeah, I'm going to train a gazillion sets and I'm going to train 6 days a week and it's going to be to failure and beyond failure. No, you're not going to recover from that. You can't do that. You literally, physiologically cannot max out every variable at once. It's just not going to work. Okay? Another problem is not distinguishing between session and weekly volume. So sometimes this conversation about volume can become almost incoherent if you're not making a distinction between volume you do per session, volume you do per week, volume you do per exercise, or volume you do per muscle. And then on that last note, talking about muscles, sometimes there's disagreements back and forth. Does lat pull downs or pull-ups count as a biceps exercise? If you count it as a biceps exercise, I wouldn't personally. It works, it's technically working, but it's not doing a lot to produce gains in my opinion. I wouldn't call that biceps work in any real significant way. Even as someone with long arms, I don't really consider it a biceps exercise. It's a back exercise. So if you don't if you disagree on what constitutes an exercise per muscle, right? If you're lumping in compounds and isolations all together, well, then you're going to have inflated numbers compared to someone like me who doesn't. So when I say, oh, I only train like 4 to 6 sets per muscle per week, or maybe per exercise per week, that sounds really low until you realize, oh, I consider lat pull down not a bicep movement. If someone else did, well, then you would double that number and you would say that's more like 10 to 12 sets per muscle per week. So all of a sudden, now you can start to see where those numbers come from. So part of this just comes down to the fallacy of equivocation, where we don't make sure to define our terms. And then on to the next big picture training variable is frequency. So this is how often do you train? And not necessarily like breaking it down to the point of multiple workouts per day, but just simply put, how many days per week do you train? And if there's something you don't train on a week-to-week basis, do you train it every other week, right? Do you alternate exercises, like a week 1, week 2 type of thing? I know people like natural hypertrophy, he only trains overhead press like once every 2 weeks because he swears that it makes his shoulders too big or something like that, which I think is silly, but hey, it is possible to train an exercise like once every 2 weeks and still make gains. And again, going back to not isolating variables, trying to stop isolating variables, if someone can make gains training something only once every 2 weeks, it's probably because the volume and intensity are high enough that with the low frequency, it just doesn't matter. It evens out in some sense. Okay, so you need to understand this fundamentally with frequency. The more sets you do per exercise on a given day of training, the more sets you do, the less days per week you can or should spend training that particular exercise. If you do squats with 10 sets, somehow, for some reason, you're doing 10 sets of squats, that's good for the week. In all reality, that's good for the week, okay? Or if you do 5 sets on Monday, waiting till Thursday or Friday to do another 5 sets is probably adequate. You're not going to want to do 3 times per week squat programs or a squat every day program if you're doing 5 grueling sets. It's just not a good idea, okay? And not only does the amount of volume you do on a given day help determine how many days you train, the closer to failure you train, the less days you're going to train. So if someone does 4 sets, 2 failure, grueling sets, rest pause sets, slow eccentric, partials, whatever, these are just the most intense sets you've ever seen in your life, you're not going to be able to spam that muscle group or that exercise 3 to 4 times per week. It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. Maybe 3 times, but probably not 4, certainly not 5, certainly not 6. You're not going to get multiple good quality sets like that unless you use an absolute baby weight, right? Like you can't have that. You can't have all the variables all at once. And certainly the more intense, the more hardcore those sets are on any given day, and just overall, the more hardcore you train that movement, the less days you should spend training and the less days you can spend training that particular muscle group or that exercise. But I will say this, training more frequently, like let's say training a movement 2 or 3 or 4 times per week versus only training it once a week or even less, does help quite a bit with improving your skill, so making you better at the thing, better technique, better mind-muscle connection, neurological skill, all that stuff, right? And probably it could help with overall compliance. So if you hate training your abs, you hate training your biceps, you hate training your calves, do it more often. Just do 1 or 2 sets. Do 3 sets with a sissy weight. I don't care. It's your training. Do it however you want. But if you train it more frequently, you're going to get better results because you trained it more consistently. So if frequency is a vehicle for someone to be consistent and also get good at something as a skill component, then that's a good reason to train something 3 or 4 times per week, in my opinion. In fact, it's also a good reason to train 2 times per week. My general rule for most people, for most exercises, for most muscle groups, 2 times per week works wonderfully well. Again, that's contingent on other variables, but nonetheless, you don't need to think about, oh, I need to train it 5, 6, 7 days per week. Guys, rest days have value, okay? You don't need to be doing everything every day all the time. All right, and on to exercise selection. I would say exercise selection should be about not only making this decision in your head to be like, I want optimal exercise for muscle group A and this one for muscle group B and C. And that's a really boring way to look at training, guys. I think you should look at movements that look cool, that are fun to train, that are practical and effective for the muscle groups, but you should also aim to get good at whatever movements you choose. So regardless of what exercise you choose, you should try and get good at it. And this is one of the reasons why I think machines are very boring. Even though they technically do work the muscles, they're absolutely effective, especially for lower body things like hamstring curls, leg presses. They can be a really nice way to push joint-friendly volume to help you get extra gains, but there's not a lot of room for skill to get good at it, to get extra gains by improving your efficiency, right? Building your confidence so you can push yourself harder. But those barbell movements and those calisthenic movements and even dumbbell movements force you to control the movement. There's some coordination going on, some balance component even, right? So they force you to get good at a thing. And I think that part of what should inform your exercise selection is, I'm gonna pick some things and I'm gonna get really good at them. And maybe I really suck at this thing right now, like back squats or front squats, or maybe it's your bench press that sucks. Aim to get good. Aim to get good at things. And on top of that, I want you guys to try and avoid redundancy. So if you're training lunges and Bulgarian split squats and back squats and front squats, some of that volume is superfluous. Do you really need to train all of those in the same given week? Maybe you can have a week 1, week 2 rotation. Maybe you can have a 3 to 4 month program rotation where you focus more on unilateral kind of bodybuilding style work versus that more powerlifting, Olympic squatting type of work. So it's up to you, but you don't need to just spam every single variation possible, right? If you're doing 1 or 2 exercises that work a given muscle group, that's probably adequate, unless we get into the nuance of things like upper chest versus lower chest, VMO on the quads versus the rest of the quads, etc., etc. But overall, avoiding redundancy saves you time and it saves your joints, because the more presses you do, the more squat pattern movements you do, the more you're sharing those joints, right? The more wear and tear you put on your knees or your elbows, your wrists, etc. It's not that all these things are created equally, and of course it depends on those other variables anyways, like the intensity used, proximity to failure, but nonetheless, the more variations you do that share joints, the more your joints are going to feel it. Now keep this in mind as well. The more exercises you do for a particular muscle, the less volume you have to spare. It just stands to reason that if you do 3 biceps variations that aren't all that different, like a reverse curl is decently different from just a standing strict curl, but if you have preacher curls and standing strict curls, and then you have like spider curls, they're all just curls, right? So you can't handle the maximal amount of volume for each one that you would be able to do if you just had one variation. That doesn't mean it's wrong to do multiple variations. It's just something you should consider. Less volume you can or should do. And now we're going to move on to intensity, to sort out this intensity confusion that I think a lot of people have. Now, it's important to distinguish, are we talking about intensity, meaning the percentage of 1 rep max used, the load used, how that represents how strong you are? Or are we talking about how close you take a set to failure? Because if someone does 12 reps on an AMRAP for pull-ups, you can look at that and be like, bro, that was an intense set. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. So if we mean if we mean to say that a set is more hardcore, more intense, the closer it is to failure, I think that's a pretty reasonable working definition of intensity. But yes, traditionally, generally speaking, Intensity does refer to the percentage of 1 rep max used. It's not something you even necessarily need to know or need to think about or program for. Look, if you know, roughly speaking, how strong you are based on your working sets or previous attempts at maxes, you don't really need to know at every single stage of the journey, every single week, every single session, what percentage are you working with? Because what used to be 90% of your 1 rep max, 3 weeks later or 6 weeks later, depending on who you are, isn't. So it's kind of a moot point anyways. I know that is part of a lot of traditional programming, right? Oh, you keep the percentages at the start, and then after the 10 weeks, and then assess yourself, and then deload, and then you use the new percent. Yeah, whatever. You don't have to do any of that. Maybe that'll rub some people the wrong way, but you actually don't have to calculate things like pretty much ever. Okay, you really don't need to know. You just need to train hard and be consistent and focus on quality reps and accumulate that tonnage. And if that tonnage allows you to push yourself further and harder, then whatever, right? It's about pushing tonnage. So don't obsess over finding minimum intensities. There's this notion that there's like a minimum percentage of 1 rep max that you can work with and still build muscle. I would say we don't really know what it is, and we don't really need to know what it is. When I did dragon boat for the first time back in college, I was on one side of the boat, the right side, leaning out, paddling. Okay, so holding it with my left hand over top, there was a curve in my back, and we were rounding our spines. And guess what? When you do hundreds of those repetitions of paddling in a race or in a practice, it built muscle on my lower back, despite the fact that it was reps that were higher than 30. So I can tell you anecdotally, you can absolutely build muscle with reps higher than 30. So don't worry about, oh, is 60% the minimum? Is 40% the minimum? What about blood restriction training? Like just stop. Stop worrying about what the minimum intensity is. Just find an intensity that you can work with and want to work with, and work with it. And if you don't want to work with it, well, if you're being a little sissy, quit being a little sissy and work with it, right? Sometimes people don't want to do 20 rep maxes on leg press. That's intense. That's strength training. I don't care what anyone has to say about muscular endurance and hypertrophy. That's strength training, and it sucks, and it's hard, and people don't want to do it because it burns and it makes you gas out, right? So let's not be ridiculous about this. Let's not miss the cart for the horse, the forest for the trees. All right. And in my opinion, sets should be as hard as possible while still being relatively safe and sustainable. So if this is how your session looks, can you make a bunch of these sessions? Can you do that 10 more times without having issues? Can you do this for 3 months straight without having issues, right? If you take a deload, is it just a day off? Is it, oh, this one session I feel beat up, I'm going to go a bit easier. That's great, but you shouldn't feel like you constantly have to spike your training and then, drop it, right? It shouldn't be that dramatic of a difference. Onto range of motion obsession, I would call it. This is when people just get way too far down the rabbit hole of stretch and full range of motion. Or even on the other side of the coin, you can't do full reps with lockouts because it'll ruin your joints. Guys, just stop obsessing over it. Pick ranges of motion that work within the limitations of your flexibility and work hard. Because if the sets don't have high effort, then it doesn't even matter whether you did a full lockout or a partial. Partial reps are effective, but are they necessary? For some people, on some exercises, they might be very beneficial. I can tell you, working with various clients who have different joint pains and injuries and surgeries, yeah, there's a lot of room for partials to be beneficial. That doesn't mean that person can't improve range of motion. Often they will with consistent training, but you don't have to be in a hurry to maximize range of motion. So stop obsessing over it. All right? There are such things as riskier positions. Just listen to Tom Platz here.
Back in the early 70s, I did stiff-legged deadlifts. After much back problems, I said, forget about it. I think it's too risky. I think the stiff-legged deadlifts people do, too much risk. I can milk it out of leg curls for you. I can do stuff that's less risk, even better results.
Now, it's not to say that stiff leg deadlifts are bad, but genuinely, by putting that extra stretch on the hamstrings, it is a more precarious position. Just like preacher curls are a more precarious position. just like various exercises can be. A Jefferson curl is more precarious of a position than a conventional deadlift. I'm not trying to tell you there's this magic sweet spot when, oh, that's too much spinal flexion. Do we really want to find out the hard way? Do you really have to max out every exercise? Or can you just say, hey, this exercise is just a little bit more iffy, so I'm going to hold back intensity. I'm not going to do 1 rep maxes on this variation because it seems to be a little bit more sketchy of a position. Just use your intuition, use your common sense. You don't have to quantitatively figure out all this, but just know, yeah, legitimately, some exercises do put you in kind of a gnarly position, and so you need to be a little bit extra careful. That's common sense. That's not radical anti-science jargon, all right? And yeah, so more stretch does not equal more gains. Let's all just shut up about stretch medial hypertrophy. It's a stupid concept, and let's move on. All right, the form policing. Good technique is objective, but that doesn't mean that we should all just go around and micromanage how each other trains. Technique's gonna still vary from person to person, even though what's good definitely is an objective thing. For each person, it might objectively look a bit different. And you might even change and adapt your style over time. Sometimes the same Olympic athlete might widen or narrow their squat stance. Doesn't mean they were doing it right before, now it's wrong, or vice versa. So you can have multiple techniques that are good. And you can certainly have a variety of techniques that are trash, like bouncing your bench and really lifting your bum off the bench, and getting your spotter to help you with the weight, and not having a good bar path, and doing like an ugly guillotine press. Yeah, there's a lot of examples of what can go wrong on movements, especially compound movements, let's say, but that doesn't mean we need to police each other on what it looks like. Here's a good rule of thumb. If a person that you're watching lift is stronger than you, mind your own business. Just say nothing and move on. Even if it looks like they could have done something better, they'll probably point it out themselves. Or maybe they'll just get themselves hurt, and then maybe you were right. Maybe you'll be vindicated. But in the moment, do you really need to start an Instagram or YouTube debate with someone about technique when they can like deadlift 300 pounds more than you? Is that really productive for either party involved? No, I don't think so. Okay, so form overall, in my opinion, should be pretty strict, right? Strict for the sake of your muscles, for the sake of preserving your joints, for the sake of creating a consistent training environment from which you can determine actual progress. Going from 10 to 11 reps is legit because the reps look the same. That's a great way to think about training and progressions. But nonetheless, they don't have to be perfect. In fact, you can even do a little bit of a cheat curl, and if the cheat is consistent, hey, that's in some sense strict, or in some sense controlled, and you know what? That's good enough for me. Now, one last important point to look at. Okay, so program examples. So I just wanted this to be a quick visual aid for you guys to understand this. If you try to maximize intensity, it's going to come at the expense of volume and frequency. That doesn't mean that working with a high percent, let's say 90% or more of your 1 rep max each week, isn't possible or sustainable or beneficial, or that training every set all out to failure or beyond failure with rest pauses and drop sets and so on and partials, that's never worth it. But if you are training very intensely with heavy weights or crazy all-out sets, you can't train as much volume, you can't train as often, right? And the same is true for training more often. If you want to maximize that frequency, it's going to come at the expense of the daily, right, the per session volume, and also the expense of the intensity as we just described. And then lastly, of course, maxing out volume per session, right, per session. So 10 sets in a given session means you're not going to train 5 times that week. But if you do 2 sets in a session, maybe you could train 4 or 5 times that week. It's up to you to decide which of those you prefer and lean into. Okay, same thing with intensity. It can't be maxed out if the volume's maxed out. So this is really how these variables interact. I don't want you to think about numbers here, about is it this percent or that percent of 1 rep max. I don't want you to think about is he saying that 1 is a good frequency, or is he trying to say that 4 or 3 is better? No, it's not about that. Is he trying to say 5 or 6 sets is better than 10 to 12? No, it's not about that either. But guys, keep in mind this. As one of these dramatically increases, something else has to be lowered. And that is the truth. about exercise training variables. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. A bit longer of a video. It's great to be back doing the lectures. It's been a little while since I made a lecture for you guys in the Smart and Simple lecture series playlist, and I'm glad to be back. So thanks for joining me today. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you disagree with me on how these training variables interact and your recommendations, feel free to make a video response or let me know in the comments below. Either way, have a great day, folks, and I'll see you in the next one.